Just bring up the slides. Okay, so programming, no? This is not machine learning yet, but it is a tool for us to implement the different machine learning models. Kasi maganda is if we take a certain concept, let's say a certain algorithm for supervised learning, maganda kung may implement natin siya with some actual data. So again, we don't go to the conceptual part. So we've seen what Jupyter Notebook looks like. You can actually use this to create notes as well. Here's an example of a notebook running with a bunch of code already in it. So let's first talk about programming in general. Now, you can think of programming, or at least the easiest way to think of programming is like it's reverse math. Okay, kasi sa math, di ba, when we have a certain equation, let's say 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, the left-hand side of the equation, the left of the equal sign, is our operation, let's say addition, no? And then the right-hand side is an answer. In programming, try to think of it as reverse, wherein the left-hand side of the equation is the answer, the right-hand side is the operation. Okay, so you actually have solutions from right to left, not from left to right. And where will that come in? Okay, so let's take a look at the building blocks of programming, declaring variables. A variable is simply a placeholder that will represent any object or any value in your code. In Python, we write it literally this way. You have a variable to the left-hand side of the equation, and then some operation to the right-hand side. So in this example, we have the variable x, okay, and then we have the expression, the mathematical expression 1 plus 1. So we're simply adding the hard-coded value 1 and 1 together. Now let's get a little bit deep when it comes to terminology. Because we have a value 1 that is literally the value 1, we call this as a scalar value. In programming, we sometimes call it hard-coded values kasi we type in the actual value in our code. Now, how does that look like in our Jupyter Notebook? Okay, so ngayon, pagpunta ko sa Jupyter. Okay. Before we attempt to write the code, let's first examine the different parts of the notebook. In here, where the current prompt is, yung cursor ko, no, is what we refer to as a cell. Now, there are many forms of a cell. In this workshop, we'll just be taking a look at two forms of a cell. Either a cell can be code or a cell can be marked down. Okay. Now, how do you know if it's code? As you can see, my cell is highlighted here in this drop down just below the widgets section of the menu. It's highlighted as code. But if I click on this, you can see that you have 4 other different versions of that cell. Okay. I'll actually show you the markdown version of it. When I switch to markdown, notice na nawala yung parang in dito, the word in, shaka brackets. Hopefully everyone can see that, no? And instead, you're just given a prompt. Now, what is markdown? Markdown is actually a formatting language. It's not a programming language because you can't supply any logic to it, but rather it's a formatting language to, format text. Let me share sa chat the cheat sheet on how to write a markdown code. Kasi this will be very useful later on for documenting your notebook. So I'll share it over a chat. Okay, you can refer to the link sa chat. And let's take a look at it very briefly. It's a formatting language. So you can see here that, for example, if I want to create a heading, I would put a hashtag beside my heading value. So let me try that out. Check out sa notebook ko. Actually put this over here so I can easily reference it. Cheat sheet here. Okay. So if I were to have a heading, again, this cell is currently in markdown mode. So let's say basic programming concepts. Now, if I want to render this cell, meaning I run it in the notebook, you have the run button right here. Okay, so if I click on run, as you can see, it will format, oops, na double click on, so let me just cut that out. Na format yung cell as a heading 1. Now it creates this nice large font to emphasize a header value. You can actually edit that cell by double-clicking it again, and you're down to its raw code. So let me add a bit more. Let's say 2 hashtags. If you take a look at our cheat sheet, is heading 2. So it's slightly smaller header version. So for example, I'll start off with part 1, declaring variables. Okay. So I'll write in some markdown mode, but I'll leave it up to you to study the different formats here, but I'll use them to document my notebook. You can do the same way if you have your own style. No need to worry about the format yet. You can just type in plain text for all that matters. As long as it's much more readable to me. Okay? But in this case, I'll type in the things that we will be discussing so far. So to declare a variable, okay, we choose a letter, okay, and take note, or a letter or phrase, okay, without any spaces, and assign a value to it. Now, when we assign a value, okay, example, x is equal to 1 plus 1. Okay, in this example, we have x is our variable. Okay, to the left of the equation, the equal sign. Okay, and then 1 plus 1 is any operation that will yield a value. So in this case, this is a addition operation. If I run this, okay, this is what it looks like. Okay, so it's sort of documented this way. And let's try to run it in the next cell. Sorry, I forgot to add another thing. If the variable is at, okay, so let's note this. So note. If the variable is at the last line of a cell, again, a cell is where we type stuff in, it will attempt, or Jupyter, to be specific, will attempt to print it out. Okay, so let's see what this means. If I have x, which is my variable, now notice in this next cell, we could actually create multiple cells. In this next cell, this is code, not markdown, as seen here. If I click on this, it's markdown, but if I click on the next cell, it's actually code. X is equal to 1 plus 1. Okay, so this is a variable x whose value is equal to 1 plus 1. When in this note, no, if the variable is at the last line of the cell, so for example, I create another space here and I have x as the last line, Jupyter will attempt to print it out. Okay, so if I run this cell, and we again, to run a cell, we click on run as the cell is highlighted. Okay, notice it now has an out prompt, which is 2. Okay, so it attempted to print out the value of x, right, as 2. Okay, so feel free to try it out, no? Put in some variable equals some operation to the right-hand side, and then have that variable as the last line of the cell, and it will try to print it out. Okay, you should get something like 2, or you could try some other numbers out. Okay. Now, alternatively, okay, other things we can observe. This cell, after we press run, now has a number, okay, to the left of it. This number indicates the process number. Or because Python evaluates each cell at a time, that number indicates where the Python interpreter is. Okay, so this is the process 1 of the Python interpreter. Because remember, Python will need to take the source code, in this case, our x equals 1 plus 1 and an x there, and then interpret it to machine code. So it will run it in our computer and then have some output displayed. Okay, so this is process 1 in this case. So we're produce another cell. You could actually manually add the cell using the plus here. Pero let me create another markdown cell, okay, and say alternatively, we could use the print method or function, okay, to print out the value of a variable. Now, what is a function? Now, if you know, remember this morning, we had f of x, and we said f is a function, and that's exactly that in Python. A function is any operation or any routine that performs a specific objective. There are a lot of functions in Python that are already built in, one of which is print. Okay, so the name of the function is print, and we know it's a function because it has parentheses in it. It's one of the most basic functions we have in Python, whose purpose is to print out the value of a variable. So this is the second way we could actually get um, some values printed out in our notebook. Either you have the value that we want at the last line of the cell, or we could pass that value to the print function to print out the value of a variable. Okay. Put in x, where x is some variable. This is marked down, so if I run this won't have any effect in the code, but rather it's documentation. In the next cell, what I'll do is I'll show the basic operations that we can do with Python. Okay, so for example, I have a variable called product whose value is equal to, let's say, 5 times 2. So in this case, you have a multiplication operation. And we'll also have division. So let's say quotient is equal to 12 divided by 2. Okay? And then we also have so multiplication, division, of course, subtraction, so difference. Okay, notice the name of the variables are just words. No? Instead of just one letter, I have collection of letters. So let's say 5 minus 3. Okay. And then I would have sum. Okay. Now notice sum is actually as a reserved word kasi na-highlight siya. So um, I'll just use summation. Yeah, summation is equal to 5 plus 2, which is the same thing that we had earlier. Now, if I wanted to print out each of these, I could actually say something like print product, okay, print quotient. Now, notice they're not in the last line of the cell. So the moment Python interprets these parts of the code, so it reads it from top to bottom, it will attempt to print out those values. Print difference, and finally print summation. Okay. Now, if I run this, because this is Python code, okay, it will print out the necessary values accordingly. So you have product, which is 10. You have quotient, which is 6. And you have difference, which is 2. And finally, summation, which is 7. So print is another way to get output, okay, from our notebook.
Sir, question lang pa. If we don't use print, ano pa yung mangyayari?
Well, nothing. You mean we don't use print here?
Right.
Ang mangyayari dyan, okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm commenting code out. Okay, notice that I put a hashtag before print. What this does is you can also use hashtag in any point in your code to comment out. So try to think of it as documentation within your source code. Um, comment out your code. This means that Python will not interpret it. Okay, so it's the same in this example. It's the same as parang wala siya. It's the same as if I deleted it. It's the same. So kung wala, then if I run this cell, then nothing gets printed out. Right? You just performed an operation. However, it's important to take note that anything or any variable that was declared before is available in other cells. Okay, let's note that up. Note that as well. Any variable declared before a cell, okay, is carried over to the other cells. Okay, now, what do I mean by this? Let's say I wanted to print out X. Okay, asan dineclare si X? Dito siya dineclare sa taas. So if I say print X at this point, it will still receive the number 2 because it's still visible within the entire process kasi na-declare siya dito sa taas. Right? So, wala si X dito, wala rin tayong dineclare na X dito, pero X is still visible with the value, the current value of 2. And so we can still use it in succeeding cells. Notice also that the process changed when I ran the cell again, it changed from 2 to 3 because this is now the third thing that Python ran. And in this next cell, it's changed to 4 because this is the fourth thing that the notebook actually ran. Right? Now, why is that important? Because if I edit the cell above, okay, let's say I edit this part, and I put in some other code, let's say y equals 2 plus 2. Okay, and I attempted to print y here. Notice if I try to run this. Itong cell na to, no? Okay, what did I do? I added some code here. I'm trying to run another cell somewhere at the bottom. If I run that cell, mag-error tayo. So sabihin niya, name y is not defined. Okay. Dinagay ko siya dito. Okay. Now, based on your observation, why do you think this is the case? I put y here naman. I declared y. I printed y here, pero nag-error tayo. Sabi niya y is not declared. Why do you think this is the case? Pero si X
Wala pa
gumana.
walang output po.
Hindi sa walang output. No? Hindi sa walang output. We didn't print y anywhere.
Yep.
But rather, we did not run this cell yet. Inedit
Okay.
lang natin siya. So this is still process 1. It still contains the old code as if we ran process 1. Okay, so
Okay.
notice, if I try to run this again, okay, we still get the same output 2. It's now process 6. Okay. Now, if I try to rerun the cell, this should be process 7. I now get 4. So now y is visible. Okay. So what's my point here? Make sure that you know where you're currently running, especially if you edit things beforehand. An easy way around this is to reset everything. Now, you start from 0 again. In terms of the process, no, not in terms of the code. Kasi yung code na sulat nyo na sa notebook. Okay. So, how do we reset things? There are a lot of buttons here that you can see. We'll go over them as we deal with more complicated things. But the easiest way to reset is to use this forward button. This says restart the kernel, then rerun the whole notebook with dialog. So when I click on this, it will ask me if I'm okay to restarting the kernel. What's the kernel? The kernel is the thing that interprets it's your Python interpreter for this particular notebook. So you reset the Python interpreter, okay, and then run everything from top to bottom. So when I click on restart and run all cells, it essentially resets everything and runs everything. So now you have the proper sequence 1, 2, 3, and then 4. Okay. And that's the basic way we can declare variables and execute or print out stuff in Python. Okay pa so far?
Yep.
Okay, let me know if we're going too fast, no? Para we can slow down. Okay. Still on the topic of variables. Okay? We can actually, okay, one last example before we move to the next one. We can actually combine different variables. So I'll switch this to Markdown. Let's say we can also perform arithmetic, okay, or mathematical operations against variables. So for example, let's say I have another variable z. Z is equal to x plus y. Okay, then I print out z. Or I could just say z here. Okay, again, If the variable is the last part of the cell, Jupyter Notebook will attempt to print it out, or you can use the print function. So in this case, I am just taking the value of x plus y, I'm adding it together, I get, and now we have the value 6. Okay? So you can eventually, you'll be reusing these variables for all sorts of things in your code. Now, the next part we'll discuss is data types. They're still fundamental. So what are data types? Okay, data types define what type of data, okay, of course, it's a cyclical definition, a variable can take. Now, the thing with Python is that Python is considered a loosely typed language. Loosely typed language. Okay, now, what does this mean? It means that the data type of the means that the data type of a variable is dependent on the value you pass to it. For example, if we said x is equal to 1 plus 1, because both 1 and 1 are integers, okay, this will yield x is considered to be an integer, okay, because we have two integers that are added together. Okay? However, if we have yung kanina, no, let's say y equals 12 divided by 2, because there's a possibility that the quotient might not be a whole number, might be a decimal number, okay, y is considered to be a decimal number. Okay. Or another way to force a decimal number is if you use decimal numbers. Okay. 0.0, for example, 12.0 divided by 2.0. Okay. To get the, or to determine the data type of a variable, we can use the type function. Right. So those are the examples. Let's see it in action. So let's say x equals 1 plus 1. It will print out x. Will also print out the type of x. Okay, notice what I'm doing here. Instead of simply, type is also a function the same way print is a function. So type of x will give me the data type of whatever value we pass to that function. That result is then passed to the function print so that we print it out doon sa natin. Similarly, if we had y equals 12.0 divided by 2.0, if we attempt to print y and print out the type of y, okay, we now get the following. Okay, so it prints out 2 first, which is correct. 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. The type is what we call an integer. Okay, so it says here class int. And then same goes for y. Y is 12.0 divided by 2.0. And we get the value 6.0. Okay. So what are the different data types that we have out there? Or at least the most common ones that we will use for data science machine learning? There are only, well, at least for the basic data types, we have the following. So integer will be a whole number. Okay, we have float, which is what we refer to as a decimal number. So y in this case is a float. We have a string. You know, a string is a set of characters enclosed in single quotes or double quotes. Okay, so it doesn't matter. In other languages, it actually matters. Pero in Python, whether you use a single quote or a double quote, it's the same thing. You're dealing with a string. I'll show some examples of that later on. And then finally, lastly, you have Boolean, which is either true or false. Now, true or false spelled this way is a literal value. So you really have a value called true, which is all things true, and then false, which is the opposite. Let's take a look at some examples. Okay, I'll repeat the example for integer. I have a comment right here, but this is considered technical code. So x equals 1 plus 1. Okay, print out x. Example for float. This is something we've already seen as well. Y or x, I just say x int, y float. Notice I can also use underscore to name my variables. This is also a common convention used in Python because you can't have spaces. You can't say y space float. So if you want to have more descriptive variables, you can use underscore for that. So in this case, I have 1.0 plus 1.0. So print y float, for example. For a string, remember, it's enclosed in double quotes. So I could have something like message is equal to hello world. Okay, that's an example of a string or single quote. Okay, it's the same thing, right? It's a set of characters enclosed in either single quote or double quote. And then for Boolean, it is world round. Okay, usually for Boolean values, I like to name it with the starting is. Okay, so is something. So it's like saying if this thing is true, then this thing is either true or false. It's a Boolean value. So this one will be true. Okay, notice that Boolean just will only accept the values either true or false. So we'll evaluate the value either. And then of course we could print them. So print is world round and then print message. So if you run the cell, it will simply print out their corresponding values.
Sir, hindi na ba gumagamit ng character data type sa Python?
There is, pero they just at the end of the day always evaluate the strings. So characters in Python are often used as integers. Because at the end of the day, characters are also integers. So let's see the character C. There's an integer counterpart for that. Okay, pero unlike some of the sort of lower level languages like C or C++, character has its own data type. In the case of Python, they're all just evaluated as strings. If you really wanted to use a character, integer yung ginagamit.
May shortcut ba dun sa pagpapalit ng code to markdown?
Wala eh.
Punta ka talaga dun, okay.
Punta ka talaga dito. You highlight the cell, tapos you either switch it to markdown or code. I might not know of a certain, baka may certain shortcut, pero I don't currently know kung meron. Okay, other questions first in the case of naming variables. Okay. Now, because we've already introduced strings, again, there's a lot to cover when it comes to this programming aspect, no? But I'll just cover the basics enough for us to get started with actual machine learning stuff. But since we already put strings on the table, strings is actually a very common data type because it's text, essentially. No? And text can be used in all sorts of use cases, of course, to simply print out messages. But more importantly, you'd often use strings to simply print out what's going on in your program. Okay, for example, actually, let me show you a real world example of how Python is used in machine learning. So I have an ongoing project here called PyUnit, which is a machine learning research work I'm doing for university for specifically for segmentation. Okay, now I just like it to I just like to show you the code in Python and how like fully blown Python code looks like. So you might have something like this, okay, that performs machine learning tasks. Specifically, if I let's see if I can run this out here. So this one would show, oops, it's not a good result. um, so this is the result of, isn't it good? Team yata ako sa training dito. Anyway, the idea here is to be able to take this image and then this is the actual mask. The output of the machine learning algorithm should be able to be the same as the mask. So as you can see, hindi siya kaganda. Just kind of weird. Pero that's besides my point. Yung point ko dito is if you take a look at the output of the program, it prints out a bunch of things. Okay, this is actually the result of print, the print function. So the print function actually goes a long way. Aside from simply printing values out, you would use it to also print out text in order to see what's going on in your program. Okay? So let's see what else we can do with the print function as well as with strings. So there's this concept called string interpolation. Yeah, put it as a subtopic. String interpolation. What this means is that given a value, or given a variable rather, given a variable, I'd like to insert that variable inside my string. Okay, so for example, let's say I have the variable x equals 1 plus 1. Or let's say, sorry, let me repeat that. X is equal to 3, kunwari. Y is equal to 5, kunwari. And then z is equal to x plus y. Okay, we can do this because x and y are numbers. Therefore, I can perform the addition operation with it. I store the value into the variable z. Now, what does it mean by string interpolation? If I wanted to print out something like the value of x, or the sum of x and, these single quotes, the sum of x and y is z, this is just a normal string, right? If we print this out, then all we really get is the text, the sum of x and y is z. But what if we wanted to substitute x, y, and z with their corresponding values? Because we want to see what the value of x is, what the value of y is, and of course what the value of z is. Then what we do is we interpolate these variables into the string. We insert them inside the string. And the way to do that is we put the letter F in front of our string and insert the values into a pair of curly braces, okay, in the string. Okay, so what does that look like? Okay, I'll leave both examples so you can actually see the difference. So we do a print. Now the string will start with an F, and then we have our double quote here. Okay, you can think of F as format, F for form. So we say the sum of, and then because we want x to be the variable x, we put it inside yung curly brace. Okay, so we have curly brace here, x. Okay, notice iba yung kulay niyan. Jupyter actually treats it as a different color. And y, okay, is z. Okay, so the main difference, two main differences between the first print and the second print is that in the first print, wala tayong F. Second print, may F tayo. And then the second difference is that the variables are now interpolated, okay, inserted into the string. So now if you run this cell again, instead of getting the sum of x and y is z, we get the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. Yeah, kasi yung variables na yun, yung values nila is interpolated inside the string, making the result dynamic. Because now, if I change, let's say, y to 6, okay, and I run this again, the string will now be different. No? It will result to the sum of 3 and 6 is 9. Okay? And that will be very useful later on when we start debugging our code. Now, we want to understand what the values we used are, and we want to see the result. So we might want to interpolate those variables inside the string and then print out some result. Okay. See, questions first with string interpolation. Clarifications. Okay. So let's okay, so we have part one, declaring variables, we have data types. In most cases, someone will be dealing with numbers, actually numbers and arrays in particular. So one important basic concept we need to discuss before we try out a bunch of exercises, and that is creating functions. So part three, creating functions. Okay. Now, why creating functions and not using functions? Because we already know what functions look like. No? Print is a function. Let's see, type is a function. So we kind of understand how functions work. They're simply things that we call and we pass stuff into in order to perform a certain objective. Okay, but these are already built-in functions. In fact, a lot of the algorithms we'll be using are actually third-party functions that we or functions that we call from third-party libraries that we simply call and use with our data. Of course, you can invent your own algorithm, pero siguro if we have time, sa last day natin, we'll see how to do that. But in most cases, we'll take already built-in algorithms in the form of functions in order to create our models. Okay, but even with that, you'll see that there's a lot of subjectivity when it comes to machine learning. And more on that later. Dun muna tayo sa creating functions. Functions again are routines that achieve a certain objective. Now, sa simula pa lang, let's treat functions as things that they are things that return a value. Kasi there are some functions that don't return a value. Pero because we're doing a lot of computation, we expect these things to return a value. For example, type, yung function type. This returns a value, which is the type of the variable that we are examining. So when we create our own functions, we always assume that they return a value. They can also accept parameters. Okay? Multiple parameters separated by comma. Okay? Comma na comma. Okay? So let's take an example. This is where it gets a little bit weird, no? Kasi yung syntax of a function. Now, I've actually put it in these slides here towards the end. Okay? Let's take a look at the anatomy of a function. This one starts with a def keyword. Okay, you can think of def as define. I'm defining a function. It's followed by the name of the function. Now, this can be anything because you are the creator of the function. And then these are the parameters of the function. As you can see, they're enclosed in parentheses. These are two parameters, x1 and x2. They are separated by comma. Okay? And then you have a colon here, which will indicate the end of the function definition and actually the start of the logic of the function, which is found below the function definition. Okay? You also have a return keyword, which indicates how that function will return a value. Now that might be a bit confusing. So let's take an actual example. Let's say I want to have a function that multiplies called multiply that multiplies three values. Okay, so I'll have x1 as the first value, x2 as the second value, x3 as the third value. Now, are these variables existing? No, they're simply placeholders, variables that are placeholders, meaning they are meant to represent values that we pass to the functions. They're not necessarily variables that we have declared prior. Hindi pa natin siya na-declare in any part of our code. They're simply placeholders to indicate how many values these functions can accept. This function can accept. So in this example, I can accept 3 variables. Let me note here that the logic of a function, or sometimes called the body of a function, is one indentation from declaration. Okay, what's declaration? Ito yung declaration natin. So when we say that the logic of the function or yung laman ng function natin, what it actually does is one indentation. What we actually mean is one tab. Okay? So I will put a tab here. Notice nagkaroon tayong space. It's, I think, approximately 4 spaces. And then I can do any Python code within this function. So for example, if my objective was to multiply 3 numbers, okay, then I would say have something like answer, okay, kunwari that's my variable within the function, okay, is equal to x1 times x2. Okay, and just to prolong this function, just to show you that you can add multiple lines of logic in your function, I'll put the next line and say answer is equal to answer times x3. Okay, so what am I doing here? I'm first taking the product of x1 and x2 because it's a multiplication operation. Okay, and then I will replace the variable answer with the old value of answer. The answer new, the new answer is equal to the old answer, which is from this one, times x3. Now, because I want to have a function that returns a value, I will return ans. Okay, notice that I have a space, but it could work without the space. Just so I can separate like it's as if you're writing an essay, diba? Parang you group certain paragraphs together. Okay. I like to have the return statement as the last line of my function. So the return is a special keyword that returns the value of that function, which in this case is stored in a variable a and c. Okay, so that's how we create the function. And then to actually use the function, we call it as if we were calling print. We call the name of the function. Let's say multiply. I want to multiply 2, 3, and 5. Okay, so the answer to this should be 30, if I'm not mistaken. Let's try that out. I'll define the function first. Define multiply, x1, x2, and x3. Don't forget the colon at the end. If I press enter, actually Jupyter detects that, okay, you're actually declaring a function. So I'll tab it for you. And then answer is equal to x1 times x2. And then answer is equal to answer, old answer, times x3. Okay. And then we return answer. Okay. Now, usually you'd like to have a function in its own cell so that if you refactor the code, that is, you modify the code later on, you can just work on that one cell definition. And then I'll run it in order, parang I'm registering this function. I know within my code I have a function called multiply. And then now I can say something like product is equal to multiply, because I've already declared it prior, 2, 5, 2, 3, and 5. And then I could print out. I'll mix up the concepts na, no? String interpolation. Product is product. Right? So now if I run this, I'll have the value 30. Declare the function. I design the function. So we can use the term design, if you will. I'm the designer of this function. And then I call this function, store the result in a variable because it's returning something. And I print out that something into the notebook. Okay. Questions muna sa function creator. Questions? Okay. Sige. Let's try out some exercises. Okay. Let me pause the screen first. Sige. Try to review your notebooks. Try to play with stuff out. No? And then I'll prepare the exercises. Give me siguro mga 2 minutes for this. And then when I come back, I'll show what the
Sir, pwede pa scroll sa taas. Konti. Meron lang akong di nakuha. Sorry.
which part? Which part?
Sa pinaka-first po.
Data
First
type.
line. Sa pinaka-top po.
Pinaka-top.
Yan.
Okay. Alright. Pause it here. Sige, I'm still here, no? So let me know kung may questions. I'm just looking for the exercise. Mm. Okay. So just 3 exercises for now, no? To exercise how to create a function and to perform computation. Right. So these are the 3 exercises. For number 1, create a function to convert Celsius to Fahrenheit. Okay, you can Google the equation for that. It's a relatively straightforward equation. For exercise 2, it's a bit more challenging. They create a function to compute for a gravitational formula for two bodies of mass. So there's a reference here. I can paste the link in some chat. And then finally, exercise 3, create a function to convert dollars into pesos. Now, I know this is a very straightforward computation, but I'd like to see how you design the function. Because it also takes a certain level of creativity to sort of read in between the lines. No? So, for example, the problem is you want to convert dollars to pesos. But if you were to use that function over and over again, how does that function look like kaya para generic enough siya to address other factors? For example, hindi naman lagi same yung value ng dollar sa peso in that case. Okay, so there's something to think about. Okay, but in any case, siguro I could give you maybe 30 minutes or so kung kaya. Pero if you're done, please let me know if you're done with the exercise so we can take a look at some potential answers. Okay?
Sir,
Sige.
pa-scroll up muna sa taas. May
Alright. Yeah, which part?
screenshot ko lang, sir, yung sa string and do sa function.
As a string interpolation? Which one? Ito?
Yes, sir. Yung sa solution lang.
Okay. Okay na? Or
Yes, sir. Pababa na lang po ulit.
alright. So I'll leave this projected in exercises. Right? So good luck. I'm just here, no? Kung may questions. And then we'll check after.